Babel is a funny word in English. Babbling. What does it have to do with Babylon, the Tower of Babel? What is this story of the Tower of Babel all about? We're going to talk about it here today. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kairos Conversations. I am Ryan Martin, our New Testament Greek guy, and I'm joined by Courtney Trotter, our Old Testament enthusiast. If you are interested in the Old and New Testaments, in the Bible, in reading texts in a new way, seeing fresh light through the lens of biblical scholarship and understanding God's Word in new ways, you should join us as we discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. Today, we are going to talk about the Tower of Babel, where that name Babel comes from, what it means, and what it is that we are supposed to get out of this narrative. So we're really going to be talking about wordplay today, about Hebrew word plays, and you've probably heard your pastor or people on YouTube talking about the Bible mention wordplay in Hebrew. Courtney, what is that about? What is the point? What is a Hebrew wordplay?
Yeah, so Hebrew wordplay is really based on how Hebrew words are formed. They're based on this system called a triradical root. So the root of a word in Hebrew will contain three letters. And so whether it's a verb or a noun or an adjective, it'll be based on those three letters. And so that gives you a lot of ability to kind of play around with roots that have very similar letters or orders of letters, and to create kind of what we would call in English like alliteration or assonance or something like that, where we're repeating the same sounds over and over. And we tend to only do that in poetry, or, if your pastor likes to make every point start with a D or something like that. So we do it to help normally in English for memorization or to have really poetic or elevated language.
Yeah, but sometimes those things come across as cheesy or weird or kind of like, I don't know, like a
Yeah.
pun in a serious poem. Like, it's like, come on, that's cheesy. We don't do that. Does it feel different than that
Right.
in the
Yeah. So we
Hebrew?
don't, in Hebrew, it's not punny, right? Because punny is not actually funny. Punny is just like,
Ha ha
yeah,
ha,
they're
like dad
like dad
jokes.
jokes. But in Hebrew, they do this, whether in narrative, it often occurs in poetry. And so in poetry, it usually is elevating the language. It's bringing it into this certain kind of beauty and rhythm so that you get into the flow of the author and what they're trying to communicate. And oftentimes they will do it to kind of make fun of things. And this will be actually haha funny, not punny funny. And so here in the Babel story, this is one of those places where there's this wordplay, and it's almost mocking Babylon or Babel. And so it will serve this purpose. So most of the time, if you were like reading along in your Hebrew Bible while your pastor was reading some of these things out loud in English, you would be laughing inside of your head because you know what they're doing with the way they're using the words that doesn't necessarily communicate in English.
Yeah, right. You have to see it in Hebrew to get the joke, really. And even if you don't know Hebrew, we're going to help you get
Mhm.
the joke today. We just have to kind of pull it back into the original language and talk about it. So let's talk about the Babel story. Courtney, what is the wordplay here? What's
Right.
going
So
on?
most of us probably already think of like babbling or, a babbling brook as, kind of like these repetitive, unintelligible sounds. And so that is essentially the basis of the Hebrew wordplay here is that babble means babbling in English because it's confusing, unintelligible sounds because you don't speak the same language as someone else. And so that is at play here. But Babel, a lot of scholars would say actually should mean the gate of God, right? So this is the city that, according to Babylonian traditions, that the gods built and that they created this people, and these people are more human than every other people in the earth. And every other people on the earth are subhuman, right? These people are better than everybody else and have special access to the gods. And so this story is kind of tearing that idea down and making fun of Babel. It doesn't mean gate of God. It means confused language, confused speech, right? So it's making this play on words in Hebrew. More importantly, whenever we begin to look at the story and just where it falls within the narrative of Genesis, it falls into this interesting place because it comes after the end of some genealogies, and it ends with Shem, which Shem in Hebrew is Shane, which means name. shame, shame, I know your name. And so it ends with that in Genesis chapter 10. And right after the Babel story, we start with Shem's genealogy again. And so it's kind of weird here in Genesis 1 through 11 to have a story that is centered around, some type of narrative and not know a name of a person within it. We've had all of these names. And in this Babel narrative, in these 9 verses, there are no names. No names at all. We do get this play on name, right? That they're trying to create a name for themselves, but obviously they're nameless people. They're people who try to create a name for themselves, but they're nameless. First, just let's talk about what does that one language mean? Because often people think, it means that like everybody in the world only spoke one thing. But many Hebrew scholars will point out that that is actually a phrase that will talk about people that are forced into one language, like they're forced into speaking kind of one thing. So this is people from maybe many different places that have all been brought to Babylon to build this tower, to build Babylon up. And so they speak many different languages and they're forced into speaking one language. And so they have very few words, right? Babylon was supposed to have the best language in the world, but they only got few words, right?
It's like least common denominator language.
Like globish. I don't know if you knew of that phenomenon where it's like, we're going to take the 1,000 English words and kind of make a global language that makes it easy for business, right? So that's kind of what's happened here. And so there's this really simplified speech and forced uniformity. And the Babel narrative is really a narrative about empire and critiquing empire, because if we did the narrative patterning thing that we've talked about in many other videos, the same narrative patterns come up with Egypt and Pharaoh and the slavery in Egypt and the fact that they're making bricks and building things on behalf of Pharaoh, and the kind of civilization that Canaan was, the exploitative civilization that they were, and also the relationship between like Shechem and Jacob's son after the assault of Dinah. And so you're like, all of these are really terrible, exploitative situations. So this one speech and these other narrative patterns that we can find in Babylon should have us thinking of that kind of exploitative empire. So this is what we're critiquing here. All right. So as we look at this slide, you can see I've got the consonants highlighted, and I've also got them typed underneath in English. So you can see them. But just in these 9 verses, we get these repeating consonants of L, B, and N over and over and over again. So as we look there in verse 3, it says, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And then the people also say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city." And so they're building themselves up, right? We want to build a city. We want to build a name. And so we see here, it's the L, B, N. And if you were to even read this in Hebrew, all of that green section almost sounds like it rhymes, right? Hava nilbena lebenim va nisrafa lisrefa, right? So it has this sound to it as they're saying it. It sounds like, okay, this has a type of poetry to it a little bit. But one thing that's worth noting is that these words that are translated "make bricks and burn them thoroughly" really is just let us brick bricks and let us burn. It's just repeating the phrases over and over again, because they're going to make the bricks and bake the bricks in order for the bricks to be solidified. So it kind of is nonsense language, right? Language that you would expect if you'd come to this like kind of Mesopotamian globish dialect. So yeah, let's look there at the second part of this story to see what God's response is to these people. So he says, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language." So you see there, it's the NBL instead of an LBN, right? We've kind of reversed the order of what God's going to do. So he's going to go down and confuse their language. They're not going to build up, but it's going to be confused. And so then the story ends by saying, "Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth." And so Babel is what it is called because that root there for confused is balal. You can hear it becomes Babel because we BLL'd their language. We BLL'd, that's the triradical root. Confuse. And the word language there is safa, which is kind of the word for lip in Hebrew, the word for lip. So, which makes sense because our languages are on our lips.
Wow, that's fascinating. So the backwards of build is confused?
Yeah, or in that instance of build, right? Because we have the L in the front of it because it's that infinitive form. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then the name, we're kind of taking a break in this genealogy at the word name. And they're making a name for themselves, and this place is known as Babylon,
right.
the gate of the gods. It's like this text is saying, no, actually, like your name
Confusion.
is confusion. It's
Right.
nothingness. It's nonsense.
Exactly. And, there's some dispute and scholarship over what this tower is. Was it a ziggurat, or is it like some type of military defense or tower? And either way you look at it, it still is a judgment on that. Because if it was a ziggurat is where you've built this structure so that the gods might come down to visit the people, right? Because this is the gate of the gods and you're trying to encounter the gods. And so the ziggurats are built for the gods to come down. And so here, you built the ziggurat for God to come down, and he comes down, and instead of dwelling with you, he judges you. Or if it is a military type of tower, it still works because you built this big tower so you could see all of your enemies from far off, but you did not take into account your greatest enemy, which was God himself, who could still render judgment. So either way, it kind of works. But God is balaling their language, BLLing their language. So it's not the gate of the gods, it is Babel, confused speech.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those words that would you call this onomatopoeia in a sense, Babel, or in English that it uses, but it has this in confused language. It's just funny that same, as you said, funny that it's the same name as what we consider one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, but from Yahweh's perspective, it's like he saw the end of Babylon before it began, and even at its height, as the gate of the gods is really just a human institution that stays
exactly. And even like I said, we're not going to trace all the narrative themes down there, but it's when God comes down to judge them, and he says that nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them now, right? And so that's one of the reasons he renders judgment. That propose normally has like an injustice type of intent to it, like nothing that they plot to do. So we know that this is already an empire built on injustice. They brought in slave labor. They're utilizing slave labor. They have this exalted sense of self where they think they are more human than every other peoples of the earth. And so, it really becomes kind of a judgment on empire building, right? And the use of injustice and forced labor.
Our human propensity to make a name for ourselves at the expense of others.
Exactly.
On a huge scale, right? As we put down the people we can put down so that we can prop ourselves up. That's really powerful, and I think different from the way that I grew up hearing the significance of this story. So that's really helpful. So this same kind of wordplay, this same idea is picked up later in the Tanakh, later in the Old Testament. Can you show us one of those spots?
So this wordplay doesn't end here with Babel. So let's look at Zephaniah chapter 3. Which is famous for one of the verses at the end of that chapter. But here in Zephaniah chapter 3, we see this wordplay there. We have the same word for speech, Sepha. For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, so that they may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. So there we have name being mentioned again. And then the people who were dispersed will now be regathered. So all of this kind of narrative patterning from Babel, but the wordplay is still there with pure speech. So let's look about wordplay as well. All right, so this one might be a little bit harder to see initially. So we get that Safa Balula, which is confused speech, that BLL root yet again, confused from Balal. But pure speech, this is an odd word for pure in Hebrew. There are other more common words for pure. Like I always tell my students, like tahur is pure in that kind of Levitical purity sense. Tahur. But this one is barar for pure speech. And so it's just kind of weird. So why is it BRR? Initially, you might not think that BLL and BRR are the exact same root. Ryan, you got this really fun way of memorizing these things. But these are called liquid consonants. L and R and M and N. These guys are liquid consonants across all languages. You want to explain those to us real quick, Ryan?
Yeah, these matter in Greek. For those of you that have done Greek with us, you remember these liquid consonants. If it's at the end of a stem, they don't take a tense formative sigma. That's why we have these liquid verbs, these liquid futures and liquid aorist, right? And if you've taken Greek and Kairos, you know that liquid monkeys never run. Liquid monkeys never run. Our L sound, our M sound, our N sound, and our R sound, lambda, mu, nu, and rho in Greek. These are our liquid consonants, and they behave in certain ways across lots of different languages. And I'm excited to learn from the Hebrew
Yeah,
side
so
right now
liquid
why these matter.
consonants are consonants across all languages, and that kind of get this kind of confusion between them because your L and your R are made in the exact same part of your mouth. You're kind of curling your tongue back up to your palate. And so, one is more towards the front of your palate with that R and more toward the back of front of your palate with the L and back of your palate with the R. And so it could be easy to get them confused. And the same thing with your M and N. They're right there beside each other. So it can be easy to switch those two around. So in many different languages, the L and the R in terms of roots are interchangeable. They don't make a distinction between them. And particularly a lot of Asiatic languages, they're the exact same sound. And which is why many people who speak English who are from Asian descent may not actually make a hard R sound. It sounds more like an L when they speak because they don't have a distinction in their language. So in Hebrew, the BLL and the BRR are functionally the exact same root because they are so close together. And we see the same thing with M and N. And I just have a couple of examples there for us. So colonel, like we would say it in English, in Italian, you pronounce that L. You say colonnello. But in French, and then by way of French in English, it turned into an R sound because they're so close together. So we say colonel. And then also you hear a lot of people who have a problem saying cinnamon. They say cinnamon or something like that because they're just switching that M and N. They're so close together, it's easy to switch.
Or anemone. I see anemone.
Anemone?
Am I saying that right?
Anemone.
Anemone.
Yeah, you tell us in the comments who's right, who's wrong. We're probably both wrong. Yeah, so this is something that happens in every single language, but it's very cool to see it here in Zephaniah that we get the confused speech from Genesis 11 with the messianic promise in the messianic age that it will become pure speech and that God is going to gather his dispersed people so they can worship his name together.
Yeah. So where do we see that actually happen?
Yeah, so this is ultimately fulfilled in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 is the reversal of Babel, where Peter and the disciples go out at Pentecost and they begin speaking in tongues, and everybody's like, oh, they seem drunk or something. They're babbling, right? Nobody can understand them, but then the ones who do understand them in their own language. And so this has almost become one of those tropes. You hear it all the time, but God's kingdom is not one of these exploitative empires like Babylon or Assyria that need to be overthrown because of their great injustice. But it is one that is upside down, that he conquers through the gospel. And so he purifies their speech and regathers them together, and instead of doing it through the sword.
Amen. And this becomes one of the central themes of the New Testament is kind of anti-imperial in a certain way, that the victory we have in Christ is a different kind of victory. It's not the victory of Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of how our Bible ends, isn't it? The book of Revelation sees the downfall of this kind of empire at the hands of a lamb who was slain, right? It's a different kind of power and a different kind of victory. Awesome. What a great thread to trace through the Old Testament and eventually the whole Bible.
Ultimately, we know that the gospel overturned the Roman Empire, right? By turning people's hearts to worship the Lord. So that is the way that, Christ did it. Awesome.
So encouraging and exciting and just fascinating in terms of the language. Is there anything else you want to leave us with from this, Courtney?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much, but if you are someone who wants to kind of try to find these things on your own, you could obviously look up different blogs about Hebrew wordplay, but even more so, just if you wanted to look at some Psalms poetry or Isaiah poetry in particular, and there's some verse that you really like, if you see these kind of repeating consonants, even if you don't know the vocabulary all that well, you can pick up on the fact that these are the same letters over and over again, even with different words, so that you see some intentionality in that. One of them I can think of is Psalm 1, blessed is the man who. You get 3 aleph, sheens, and rashes right in a row for Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who, right there at that very beginning. And so you can see it in many different places there.
You can also just come learn Hebrew with us.
You can, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And it is really exciting to see, even if you don't know Hebrew, if you don't know Greek. Really, that's part of the reason we do this at Kairos Conversations, is we think that these things that help us be able to read the Old and New Testament in their original literary context, that we want everyone to know about those, whether they know this language or not. So really, thank you for joining us today. We do this every Friday. release one of these videos, so stay tuned for more. We will be looking at more Old Testament, New Testament texts and talking about how you can understand them through the lens of the original languages. We have a Patreon. If you want to support us in that way, you can get a Kairos mug, some stickers. You can get one-on-one time with our teachers. You can sign up for a free trial lesson, sign up for a Greek and Hebrew class on our website as well, always. But until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.